This is the gwolves Fenrir Asym, gwolves' second flagship fingertip optimized mouse in the Fenrir series, one that, despite being the direct counterpart to the Fenrir Max, offers some unique advantages over it, but in a very unique shell, one which I've never seen utilized on a fingertip mouse until now. Now, while on paper the Fenrir Asym and Max look very similar as they share same specs and similar weights and dimensions, there is actually a significant difference between the two, which makes the Asym a rather interesting mouse, but while it offers comparable performance to the Max, there are some interesting design aspects to this mouse, some of which do unfortunately hamper the mouse's hand size and grip style compatibility, as well as its usage and performance, while others, such as the unique shell shape, offer many advantages over the Max and other fingertip optimized mice available on the market. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to take a deep dive and talk all about the gwolves Fenrir Asym and discuss the mouse's pros and cons and how it compares to the Fenrir Max, as well as talk about which version of the Fenrir you should get. But before we get into it, if you enjoy the review and want to see more videos like this, including a full review of the gwolves HTS2 Pro and a full teardown of the Fenrir Asym, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you're interested in learning more about the Asym's counterpart, the Max, you can find my full review of the Fenrir Max linked on screen here and down in the video description. And if you want to support what I do here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and of course the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member, as it is the best way to directly support my efforts here, and channel members get early access to all upcoming episodes of the mel0n review and teardown. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. For testing parameters, I used the Fenrir Asym for roughly 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both gaming and general use on both hard and soft pad types. For sensitivity, I used my normal range of 40 to 50 cm per 360. For skates, I tested both the included stock skate types and some aftermarket skates, but I mainly used the full-size stock skates over my testing as they performed quite well. For firmware, I tested my Asym on the 1.0.39 firmware, the latest version available at the time of my review, and since the Asym uses a PAW 3950 sensor, I utilized a -4° sensor tilt on the mouse over my testing, just as I did when I reviewed the Fenrir Max. For pricing, the standard versions of the Fenrir Asyms retail for $159 USD and are available in 2 colorways, black which has a black shell and black buttons, and white which has a white shell and green buttons. There is also the special semi-transparent shelled versions, the violet one which has a transparent purple shell with white buttons, the emerald version which has a transparent green shell and green buttons, the silver shadow which is a transparent gray shell with black buttons, and lastly sapphire blue, whose shell is transparent blue and has black buttons. All of these special versions retail for $169 USD, slightly more than the standard black and white colorways, and today I'll be reviewing the Asym in the standard black colorway. For unboxing, just as is seen with many of gwolves' previous mice, including the Fenrir Max, the Fenrir Asym includes a bunch of accessories which gives the Asym, and gwolves' other mice for that matter, the best unboxing experience you'll find on the market. But before we talk about what's inside the box, I do need to yet again critique the Fenrir's packaging, as sadly it is still using the same AI generated art we've seen gwolves use before. Now I've repeated myself far too many times when it comes to this art choice here, so I'm not going to talk about this much, but I will say that I wish that Fenrir Asym and all of gwolves' other mice for that matter just use black boxes or art drawn by a person rather than this AI generated slop they keep using for their packaging art. But box art aside, inside the box we'll find the expected accessory package, a sheet of pre-cut grip tapes which are the same modular type we saw included with the Max, and the expected gray carrying case. Inside the carrying case we have 2 USB A to C cables, a gray one which is a thinner, more flexible type, and a black one which is a more rigid, thicker cable. Both of these cables do lack a tilted USB-C end, but considering that the Fenrir is designed to be a wireless only mouse and also given its size, the lack of a tilted USB-C end on these cables isn't an issue per se, as you'll rarely use the mouse wired. Also included in this case is the same semi-transparent cyan colored AK dongle that we saw included with the Max, which looks really great, And the dongle has the expected large rubber base on it, so despite the dongle's lighter weight, the large rubber base helps to keep it well anchored on most desktop surfaces. And lastly, wrapped in a fabric baggie, we have the Fenrir Asym itself, which comes with 4 PTFE dot skates pre-installed on its base. Now let's talk about the accessory package, which includes several additional items, first of which we have a large quick start guide which lists the Fenrir's specs, buttons, as well as some information about the mouse and its support information. Next we have a package of skates, which includes an additional 30 PTFE dot skates, the same type that came pre-installed on the Fenrir, as well as 2 full-size set of skates, which are surprisingly good, but I'll talk more about them later. This accessory package also includes the same skate spacers we saw included with the Fenrir Max, including both 1 and 1.5mm sizes. As I said before, these are a very underrated accessory, as you can use these to increase the height of not only the included dot skates, but also aftermarket dot skates of similar widths, and when applied makes these skates more compatible with higher LOD levels and softer pad types, and we'll talk more about these spacers later in this video. We also have 3 base cover stickers included, similar to the ones we've seen gwolves include with their other mice, which you can use to cover the Fenrir's hollow base, creating a barrier that prevents debris from getting inside the mouse. This is particularly nice to see, as not only is the shell here on the Fenrir Asym an open design unlike the Max's solid shell, the mouse's battery does have a lot of exposed adhesive on its base as well, and if left uncovered, this adhesive will collect dust and debris quite quickly, so I'd highly recommend using these base cover stickers here on the Asym. Next we have 2 foam adhesive pads included, the same type as the one that was included with the Fenrir Max, which can be used as replacement battery adhesive pads. So if you end up modding or replacing the Fenrir's battery, since you can't reuse the pad that's on the stock battery, you can use these extra pads to install the new one, so you don't have to rely on heavier double-sided tape for the installation. This again is a great accessory to see included, and I hope that we'll see gwolves include these extra adhesive pads with their future mice. Now that's all for this accessory package, but as expected for a gwolves mouse, the mouse comes with extra accessories in the form of a pack of arm sleeves, 4 packs of the gwolves lightweight clay, and the storage baggie. Now these included arm sleeves are fine, as they're a palm design, which is great for a fingertip optimized mouse like the Asym, but the sleeves material is quite rough, so when using them on fabric pads, the sleeves are a little more controlled than you'd expect an arm sleeve to be, but on hard pads they're fine, but they're not a sleeve I'd recommend using on fabric pads or a long-term use, but they'll do the trick until you can get a proper gaming optimized sleeve. Next we also have the 4 packs of the gwolves lightweight clay, which is one of the most underrated accessories gwolves includes with their mice, as you can use this clay to create shape altering attachments for the mouse, such as a finger ridge or an L-shaped anchoring point. Now since the instructions for this clay aren't exactly the clearest, I did make a guide on how to properly use this clay, so if you want to learn more about this lightweight clay and how to properly use it, you can check out my guide, which will be linked on screen here and down in the video description. And lastly we have a resealable plastic bag, which is designed to be used as a storage bag for the Asym. Now gwolves has included this baggie with all of their recent releases, as due to some models more open shell designs like the Asyms here, mice with this open shell can be rather susceptible to debris building up inside the mouse. So to prevent debris related issues, gwolves has included this plastic bag so you can store the mouse in it when it's not being used, shielding it from debris buildup. Now you don't have to use this included storage bag if you don't want to, as you can store the mouse in the product box, the included carrying case, or an anti-static bag, but it's very important that you only store the Asym, and gwolves other mice for that matter, in the listed methods, and ensure you do not use any other kind of resealable bag such as a Ziploc bag, as those types can generate static charge inside them when opened, which can damage your mouse, so be sure to store your mouse properly. And lastly, for warranty, the Fenrir Asym comes with a 1-year warranty, and you can find all the terms and conditions for said warranty over on gwolves' website. For in-game performance, the Asym was a very interesting mouse, as not only did the mouse perform surprisingly well, the mouse's shape and specs were also very well implemented, but much like the Max, there were some issue areas with the design of this mouse. Now the Asym, unlike the Max, is a much lower profile mouse, so I had to grip it very differently from the Max, as if I gripped it too far forward on the side shell, my fingers would drag against my mousepad. So I had to grip the Asym more towards the rear of its shell, and this did take some time to get accustomed to as my thumbs rested on top of the side buttons, which caused some issues which we'll talk more about in a moment. But while I had to use a unique grip style here on the Asym, the flared out ridge on the mouse's right side is a fantastic feature as it created an anchoring ridge of sorts for my pinky and ring fingers, which helped to keep my grip on the Asym quite stable. Another aspect of the Asym's design that initially did improve its gripability was its low click heights, which, similar to the click heights we saw in the HTX Mini, does ergonomically improve the Asym, but this was negated by the heavier switches gwolves used here for the main clicks, which are much heavier than the Max's, which led to some issues, and we'll talk more about that later. But unlike the Fenrir Max, whose scroll wheel was rather difficult to utilize due to its shallowness, the Asym scroll wheel is much more pronounced due to the shell's lower profile, which made the Asym scroll wheel much easier to utilize. Unfortunately though, the mouse's side buttons, just like the Max's, are positioned very far back in the mouse's side shell, and the buttons themselves are very shallow, which makes them rather difficult to actuate unless you increase their height by adding on the included side button covers, but in doing so, since I had to grip the Asym towards the rear of its shell with my thumb resting on top of the side buttons, with this increased height I found it very easy to misactuate the side buttons if I tensed my grip, which did impact the mouse's performance significantly as I'd accidentally input side clicks quite frequently. As such, over my testing I actually disabled the side buttons entirely, which helped to improve the Asym's performance but at the cost of the side buttons functionality. But on a more positive note, the mouse's specs and performance was stellar as the PAW 3950 sensor is very well implemented and also supported sensor tilting as I mentioned earlier, which massively improved the usage experience of the Asym. The mouse's battery life and high polling rates are also very well implemented as expected for a gwolves mouse, and in every game I tested the Asym in, the mouse did perform very well once I got accustomed to the mouse and disabled the side buttons that is, but the heavier main click switches did prove to be quite a nuisance over my testing, and because of this I found myself favoring the Max as its taller profile was easier to naturally grip with my hand size, and the main clicks, while they were taller, have a much more manageable actuation weight compared to the Asym. Now to be fair, many of my gripes with the Asym are due to its incompatibility with my larger hands, so while this mouse isn't ideal for my hand size, smaller hands will likely have a better usage experience with the Asym, but these heavy main click switches will be an issue for all hand sizes, and that is the primary factor as to why I prefer the Max over the Asym despite the Asym's superior shape. Now, as a precursor to this section, keep in mind that my Fenrir Asym was shipped to me directly by gwolves, so take this unit's build quality and QC with a grain of salt. Another note I wanted to make here is that just like the Max, the Asym's sideshell material has been changed from gwolves' previous mice, having a much thinner honeycomb texturing which is much less abrasive than the deeper honeycomb shells we've seen gwolves use before. As such, the Asym has a significantly better raw feeling to it just like the Max did, compared to the mice like the HTX Ultra or HTX Mini, but despite this, since the Asym doesn't have a coating, the shell is still tricky to grip, especially with sweatier hands, so to keep a consistent grip on the Asym you'll need to use some kind of grip aid such as the included grip tapes, but we'll talk more about them later. Now, improved shell aside, for build quality, the Fenrir Asym, just like the Max, is a very well built mouse, and due to the mouse's smaller, shorter profile and thicker top shell material, the Asym actually feels better than the Max as there's no creaking or flexing anywhere on the mouse's shell, even on the sides where on the Max there was some slight flexing if too much pressure was applied in this area. The Asym's internal build quality is also fantastic, without any notable issues with the PCB soldering or any of the other internal components, and just like the Max, the Asym is just as serviceable as its counterpart, so repairing, modding, or cleaning the mouse is very easy, which is very important here on the Asym due to its more open top shell design. For QC, much like the mouse's build quality, the Asym's QC is pretty much perfect. Both the main clicks are well implemented with no unevenness in their actuation weights, but they are very heavy as I mentioned earlier. The mouse's side buttons are also well implemented, but they're quite shallow, which does make them a little tricky to grip unless you raise their height with grip tape, which causes other issues, but we'll talk more about that later. And the mouse's scroll wheel, like the Max, is very well implemented, but due to the lower shell profile here, the scroll wheel is much more exposed, protruding from the top shell more, making it much more pronounced and much easier to use than the Max's shallow scroll wheel, which gives the Asym scroll wheel a full scroll range, and also it makes it much easier to utilize as I talked about earlier, which is another great improvement here on the Asym. For weight, just as we saw with the Fenrir Max, the Asym has a very low advertised weight spec, as gwolves is estimating that the mouse will weigh a mere 20.4 grams, which is around 2 grams lighter than the Max. But just like we saw on the Max, not only is gwolves not listing what configuration this weight spec was based off of, this advertised weight spec is not indicative of the Asym's true weight, as my Asym in its stock configuration with 4 dot skates weighs 21.5 grams, with the full-size stock skates it weighs 22.5 grams, and with no skates or grips installed it weighs 21.3 grams. But don't forget that since the shell doesn't have a coating applied to it, you'll need to use grip aids such as the included grip tapes, and even though the grips included with the Asym are modular, they'll still add between 0.6 and 1.3 grams to the Asym's overall weight depending on how many of the modular pieces you use on the mouse. So in reality, depending on your configuration, the Asym will weigh between 22.1, which is 4 dot skates and the half-size grip tapes, to 23.8 grams, which is the full-size skates plus full-size grips, both of which are well over the advertised weight spec gwolves is advertising for the Asym here. So much like the AI box art, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here again, but I will repeat myself. gwolves needs to better communicate the true weight of their mice, as every mouse I've covered from them is a few grams over its advertised weight spec, and this is especially important considering you'll likely need to use grip tapes on their mice since none of them have coatings. To resolve this, gwolves should absolutely be listing a plus-minus gram ratio on all of their mice, and even though there's an industry standard of approximately plus-minus 2 grams, it needs to be disclosed, and they should also list the various configuration weights for their mice with different skates and grips, so customers know the true weight of the mouse they purchase, especially considering gwolves' history with inaccurate weight specs. But while the advertised weight spec for the Asym is quite inaccurate, just like the Max, the true weight of the mouse is still very impressive considering how solid the mouse's build quality is, and I have no issues with the mouse's weight as it feels borderline weightless in the hand. I just wish the mouse's true weight was disclosed properly. For balancing, the Asym, similar to the Max, is centrally balanced at the mouse's physical midline, slightly behind the mouse's sensor location. But unlike the Max, which had a wider balancing range, the Asym's balancing range is much tighter, only ranging 1 centimeter above and below the mouse's physical midline on the X-axis. Now this does mean that the Asym is a little less flexible when it comes to grip styles than the Max was, and due to the lower profile design, if you have larger hands like mine, you'll likely need to grip the shell more towards the end region as it's the tallest there, which will cause the sensor to feel slightly fast due to it being more forwardly positioned, slightly unbalancing the mouse's feel, but this is only an issue with larger hands like mine. On smaller hands this won't be an issue, but this is something I wanted to mention regardless. For Y-axis balancing, despite the asymmetrical shape of the Asym, it is still perfectly balanced on its Y-axis with no tilt or bias to the mouse's left or right sides, but just like we've seen on many ultralight gwolves mice before, it's worth noting that when using the mouse wired, it will be quite unbalanced by the weight of the cable, causing the mouse to be very forward heavy, but seeing as the Asym is designed to be a wireless mouse, not a wired one, and that the mouse lacks any high polling rates on its wired connectivity, the only time this will impact your performance is if you're forced to use the mouse while it's charging, which will be a rare circumstance. So while this unbalancing won't exactly be a regular issue, this is another reason I would not recommend using the Asym wired. For shell shape and dimensions, the Fenrir Asym, unsurprisingly given its name, is an asymmetrical mouse having a flared out ledge on the mouse's lower right side which acts as an anchoring or stabilizing ridge, so to speak, that significantly improves the stability when gripping the mouse. Now this shape is right hand optimized as the side buttons are positioned on the left side of the shell, but the mouse is actually usable with left hands as the aforementioned ridge actually works quite well as a thumb anchor or rest, but left-hand users won't have access to side buttons, so while there is some ambidextrousness to the Asym shell, it is best suited for right-handed use. For dimensions, the mouse measures 75mm long, measured from the tip of the main clicks to the end of the rear shell. For widths, at the shell's top region it measures around 52mm wide at its base and around 54mm wide at its top. At its mid region it measures around 57mm wide at its base and around 58mm wide at its top, and at the Asym's rear region it measures around 63mm wide at the base and around 59mm wide at its top. For heights, at the top region of the shell measures approximately 12mm tall, at the mid region of the shell it measures approximately 20mm tall, and at the end region of the shell it measures approximately 27mm tall. For shell profiles, as I mentioned earlier, due to the updated shell design, while on paper the Fenrir Max and Asym look very similar, when you look closer you'll find just how different these two mice are, even though they share many similarities. Looking at the Asym from the top, we can see the mouse's shell shape with its thinner forward region and slightly wider rear region, with that flared out ridge on the mouse's lower right side. Flipping the mouse over and looking at the mouse from the base, we can again see the mouse's symmetrical shape just flipped, and you can see that the base of the Fenrir is wider than the top region as we just talked about in the previous segment. We can also see that the shell's left side right from the front is straightened with a very light outward curvature to it, while its right side left from the top angles out more to account for the flared out ridge at its base. Looking from the mouse's sides, we can see the mouse's shell curvature having the aforementioned low profile forward region, which gradually increases in height to the peak of the top shell's curvature, which slightly peaks behind the rear side button, then drastically declines, creating a ledge-like rear profile similar to the Max's, just slightly shorter. Looking from the front, we can see just how shallow the click height on the main clicks is due to the lower shell profile, and we can also see that just like the Max, the M1 and M2 buttons have a very pronounced groove running through them, which runs all the way through the buttons, which is a great attention to detail, and we'll talk about the benefits of this more in a moment. From the front, we can also see the Asym's side shell profiles, which due to its asymmetrical nature do differ from one another slightly and aren't even like they were on the Max, as the shell's left side right from the front is mostly flat, being ever so slightly outwardly angled with a slight curvature at its top region, and the side profile maintains its curvature as we follow the side shell down towards the rear region of the shell, while the right side profile left from the front has a similar slight outward angling with the same slight curvature at the top region, but this side profile angles outward more so than the left side does to account for the flared out ridge towards the end region of the right side shell profile. And from the rear, we can clearly see the ridge-like hump shaping, which just like the Max has a very wide, slightly peaked design, being much less pronounced and much wider than a traditional hump design, and we can see that it's slightly shorter than the Max's hump due to the Asym's overall lower profile shape. For contact areas from a 19.05 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a claw fingertip hybrid grip here on the Asym, as expected due to the mouse's unique shape and lower profile, my contact areas here on the Asym were quite different from the Max, as my thumb rests more towards the rear of the Asym's left side, sitting just below the side buttons or kind of on top of them, which did make them easier to actuate than the Max's side buttons as my finger rested against them instead of in front of them as they did on the Max, but this also created some misactuation issues as I mentioned earlier, as if I tense my grip I'd accidentally actuate the side buttons, but since I have such large hands this issue is very much isolated to me, but it's something I wanted to note regardless. Whereas my index and middle finger on the other hand rested more towards the mid region of the shell buttons due to my grip shifting towards the rear of the shell, while my ring and pinky finger rested towards the end region of the Asym's right side, with my ring finger resting slightly above the flared out ridge while my pinky rested against it, utilizing it as a stabilizer and anchoring point. Now for the estimated hand size and grip compatibility for the Fenrir Asym, obviously given its design, this mouse is hyper optimized for fingertip grips. However, as always, depending on your hand size, the grip compatibility for the mouse might change slightly, as larger hands like mine might not be able to grip the mouse due to its lower height profile. As such, the Asym across all hand sizes is only compatible with fingertip grips, unlike the Max, which could be aggro claw grip with some hand sizes due to its taller profile, but again, larger hand sizes in the 17 by 12 and 19 by 13 centimeter range will be too large for the Asym. But as always, this is a rough estimate and the actual hand size and grip compatibility for the Asym will vary from hand to hand. For coating, as I mentioned earlier in this video, in typical gwolves style, the Fenrir doesn't have a coating applied to its shell, so despite the improved shell texture compared to gwolves' older mice, the shell is still quite difficult to grip consistently, especially with sweatier hands or during intensive use. Therefore, you'll need to rely on grip aids such as the included grips to hold and anchor your hands on the Asym shell, but we'll talk more about the grips in a moment. Now, gwolves' reasoning behind not applying a coating to their mice is based off of weight and durability concerns, as coatings not only add additional weight, they also have very poor long-term durability. Because of this, gwolves has opted not to add coatings onto their mice and instead designed them to be used with grip tapes, as grips are not only much stickier than any coating could be while also being lighter, they also have much better durability, and when the grips do eventually degrade, you can just replace the grips, not the entire mouse. Now, admittedly, the concept of a gaming mouse releasing in 2025 with no coating is a bit shocking, but I do agree with gwolves' reasoning behind their decision, especially since their included stock grips are so good, so let's talk about them next. Now, the included grips here with the Asym are the same fantastic grips as we've seen included with the Fenrir Max and gwolves' other mice, and they're also modular in their design. Now, these grips, as expected, have the traditional raised linear hexagonal texturing and sticky material, which makes these grips very sticky to the hand and very easy to grip with both wet and dry hands. As such, when applied to the mouse's shell, they make the Asym much easier to grip than it would be when you try and grip the raw shell. Now, these grips are also extremely durable, as we talked about before, so their performance will remain consistent over long-term use, and as an added benefit, the grips are quite reusable as well, so you can not only readjust the position of the grips without damaging them, you can also move them from mouse to mouse, which is a great feature. Now, my only gripes with these stock grips is that they are a little on the thicker side and do have a noticeable edge to them, which might be a deal breaker for some people. Additionally, some people might not like the grips texturing. If this is the case for you, you can always get aftermarket grips like the Extra Bad Cicada Wings or Geckos, as both perform similar to the gwolves stock grips, just in a thinner form factor with no texturing. But keep in mind that aftermarket grips are usually thinner than the ones gwolves includes with their mice, which means that they may not be as effective as covering up the shell's honeycomb texturing. So if you dislike the textured feel of the Fenrir shell, or the feeling of any of other gwolves mice for that matter, make sure to get aftermarket grip tapes that have a thicker design so it covers the shell texturing properly. For our main clicks, the Asym is using a similar main click design to what we saw on the Max, but there are not only a significant difference in terms of the click feel, there is also a pretty significant difference in the shell button's height. Now, the buttons themselves are the same slightly outwardly angled buttons, which have a very slight roundness to them to match the Asym's forward shell curvature, with the same pronounced groove that runs through the shell buttons. The shell buttons also have a similar texturing to the rear region of the Fenrir's shell, having the same smaller hexagonal design, but with a filled area around the midpoint of the buttons where most fingers will rest, but due to the lack of coating on the shell, this area, while being solid, is still quite slippery, and while the grooves do help to guide your fingers towards the middle of the shell buttons regardless on where the buttons you click, as with the rest of the Asym shell, it's quite slippery, so I'd recommend using the included grip aids on the main clicks to make them easier to grip. Aside from their unique design, another great aspect to the main clicks here is that both buttons are quite well stabilized with only a slight degree of play to each button. However, it's worth noting that due to the deep finger grooves in the buttons do rock side to side a little bit if clicked on their edges, but since the grooves guide your fingers to the center of the buttons, this isn't exactly an issue, and this potential rocking never affected the feeling of the main clicks during my testing. In addition to the great stabilization, the main clicks are also indented into the shell, albeit slightly, but enough to prevent any interference from fingers resting against the mouse's side shell. Now, as mentioned earlier, due to the lower overall profile of the Asym, the click height here on the mouse is quite different from the Max, as at the end region of the shell buttons they're approximately 10.3 millimeters tall, at the mid region they're 15.9 millimeters tall, and at the top region they measure approximately 21.1 millimeters tall. Now, we've seen gwolves use a similar low click design on the HTX Mini, just obviously a little lower, and despite the shell's differences, this lower click height does improve the Asym's ergonomics, as the lower click height allows you to angle your index and middle fingers at more natural angles, which helps to prevent strain issues, but the effectiveness will vary from hand to hand and is kind of outdone by the click weight, which we'll talk about in a moment. For click audio, here's a quick sound test of the Fenrir's main clicks. Inside, the Fenrir Asym is using the mel0n D2LS21 switches, which are rated for 20 million cycles, the same switches that were used for the HTX Mini's main clicks. These switches are obviously much heavier than lighter switches such as the Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot switches, having an actuation weight of around 70 to 80 grams, and while they do have a better, snappier click feel in my opinion than other switch types, the actuation weight does impact the Asym's usage, as depending on where you click on the shell buttons, the main clicks can be very heavy, borderline too heavy for a fingertip optimized mouse in my opinion, as towards the end to mid region of the shell buttons they have a 70 plus gram actuation weight, while towards the mid to top region the main clicks jump to around an 80 plus gram actuation weight, which not only makes the buttons very difficult to actuate, can actually cause strain issues despite the more ergonomic click height if you hold the clicks down for a prolonged period of time, at least from my experience. For travel, both the main clicks have a low to medium range of pre and post travel, and these ranges will increase more to the mid range if you click towards the top of the shell buttons, but despite the longer travel, both buttons do have a good snappy rebound to them, but their higher actuation weight prevents the main clicks from being as spammable as the Max's main clicks. Now admittedly, the main clicks do slightly loosen up as they're used, but they're still far too heavy, and while I personally dislike most Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot implementations, I do think that a lower actuation weight switch would be much better suited for the Fenrir Asym, and on a future version I hope we see gwolves use the Wano Blue Shell Pink Dots or another lighter actuation switch here instead of these heavy mel0n switches. For the side buttons, just like the Fenrir Max, the Asym side buttons are the same smaller pill-shaped buttons with the expected forward angling that matches the upper shell's curvature. They also have the same rear positioning, being positioned roughly 4 centimeters behind the mouse's physical midline. Now if you have smaller hands and grip the Asym towards its center, the side buttons will be a little awkward to actuate as they're positioned so far back in the mouse's shell. However, if you grip towards the rear as I did, the side buttons are easier to actuate, but you can accidentally actuate them very easily if you tense your grip too much. The Asym side buttons, just like the Max's, are also very shallow and barely protrude from the side shell, which makes them even trickier to actuate, but you can fix this by using the same trick we use on the Max by applying the included side button grip tape, as this not only makes the side buttons easier to grip due to their lack of coating, it also makes them slightly taller, which does make them somewhat easier to actuate. However, as I mentioned earlier, since my thumb rested on top of the side buttons because I gripped towards the rear of the shell, I found them very easy to accidentally actuate, and because of this I disabled the side buttons entirely to prevent misactuations from impacting my performance. Now to be fair, this issue is mainly due to my larger hands. On smaller hands it'll be much harder to accidentally press the side buttons, but they will still be a little tricky to actuate due to their rear positioning and shallow height. Now gwolves could fix these side buttons here on the Asym and the Max by making them taller, just as they did on the HTR Pro, as that would make them easier to actuate. However, their positioning is still less than ideal in my opinion. On the plus side though, despite their smaller size, the side buttons are very well stabilized, feeling similar to the stabilization of the main clicks but with the same slight play to them. However, this is nothing significant enough to impact their usability. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Fenrir Asym side clicks. Inside, the Fenrir is using a familiar side button switch, the mel0n D2 LS21 micro switches. The same switch is used for the main clicks but with a lower cycle rating of 5 million cycles. Now since these are the same switches, the side buttons share the similar heavy 70 to 80 gram actuation weight, but they feel slightly lighter to me, feeling more around 70 to 75 grams on my Asym. For travel, the side buttons have a low range of pre-travel but the same low to medium range of post-travel, as you can push the buttons quite deeply into the shell after the actuation point, and similar to the main clicks, the side buttons also have a decent rebound to them, which helps make them somewhat spammable. However, in my opinion, their weight, positioning, and shorter button height negate any positive aspects to these side buttons. For the scroll wheel, as I mentioned at the top of this video, this is one area where the Asym's implementation is much better than the Max's, as the Asym's lower shell profile makes the scroll wheel much more pronounced, which makes it much easier to utilize and gives it a much wider scroll range than the Max's wheel had. Now the wheel itself is identical to the one used on the Max, being the same plastic wheel with a flattened rubber texturing wrapped around it and the same oval-like indentations cut into it, and on the inside, oddly enough, the Asym isn't using the same type of encoder as the Max, as instead is using a different TTC skew, a 4.3mm instead of the 7mm one we saw inside the Max. But despite being different from the Max's encoder, the scroll actually feels quite similar, having a very controlled feeling with more pronounced scroll points, which makes the Asym scroll wheel very well tensioned and very controllable. And for the scroll wheel click, again the Asym is using a different wheel click switch than the Max, using a super low profile switch I've never seen before, but despite its unique design, it is still a TTC skew MCU, which has a heavier click, keeping in line with the other buttons on the Asym, having an actuation weight of around 80 grams, but due to its lower profile, I found it very easy to misactuate the wheel when scrolling the Asym's wheel forward, which never impacted the performance of the mouse. It only made scrolling web pages a little finicky sometimes. Another note I wanted to make here is that the rebound for the wheel is pretty average as expected, so the wheel isn't exactly spammable, but this is to be expected for most scroll wheel implementations. For the Fenrir Asym sensor and MCU, as I mentioned earlier, it uses a PAW3950 sensor, which is a fantastic upgrade from the 3395 sensors we've seen gwolves use on their previous fingertip optimized mice. Now this sensor is the expected PAW39DM-T5QU SKU, the same SKU that was used on the Fenrir Max, which has a max DPI of 30,000, the expected 3 LOD levels, 0.71 and 2 millimeters. The sensor also supports ripple and angle snapping, which can be enabled or disabled via the gwolves web-based software. This sensor does also have motion sync enabled by default, as it always is on gwolves mice, but you cannot currently disable this feature on its current software. Now, as I mentioned earlier, since this is a 3950 sensor, it also supports the sensor tilt feature, which allows you to adjust the angling of the sensor by 30 degrees both in the left and right directions. Now, I've talked many times about how great this feature is, as people with a tilted grip like myself can use this tilt setting to match the sensor's tilt to the angle of their grip, which makes movements much more natural, especially on a fingertip optimized mouse. So unlike the HTR series mice, on which I was railroaded using a specific sensor angle, I was able to match the sensor's tilt to my grip style here on the Asym, which significantly improved the usage experience and performance. Now, if you've never used a sensor tilt before and don't know what angle your grip style uses or how to utilize this sensor tilt feature, Razer has a great tool on their website that tells you the angle of your grip, and I'll have that tool linked down in the video description for you to check out. Now, aside from the 3950 specs and features, the sensor positioning is also much more normal than we've seen on gwolves' previous fingertip mice, as the sensor is centrally positioned in the Asym shell ever so slightly forward of the mouse's physical midline. This is great to see, as other gwolves mice tend to have much higher, more forward sensor positions, so a more normal positioning is a nice thing to see here on the Fenrir, and since the sensor is located in the middle of the mouse's balancing range, the mouse will feel balanced if you grip it at its physical midline, but as I mentioned earlier, if you grip towards the rear of the mouse like I had to due to the lower shell profile, this can cause the sensor to feel a little faster as it's positioned forward with this kind of grip, and this can make the mouse feel slightly unbalanced, but not in a way that will negatively impact the Asym's performance. And for MCU, the Fenrir Asym uses the expected Nordic 52840 MCU, the same MCU gwolves use on the HTR, HTS, and HTX series mice, which has performed well. However, now that the Nordic NRF 54H20 SoCs are popping up on some mice, most notably on the Razer Death Adder V4 Pro, hopefully we'll see gwolves adopt the newer Nordic SoCs soon, as the 54H20 is significantly better than the old 52840 SoCs. For connectivity and high polling rates, the Fenrir Asym, just like the Max, supports 125Hz to 8000Hz over its 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity, but the mouse is still capped to 125 to 1000Hz on its wired USB-C connectivity. Now, since the Fenrir is a wireless optimized mouse not designed for wired use, the lack of AK polling on the wired connection is understandable, as the only time you use the mouse wired is while it's charging, and we've also seen gwolves' other mice have the same limitations when it comes to their wired connectivity, specifically their fingertip optimized mice, so this isn't surprising. That said though, hopefully in the future we'll see wired AK polling on all of gwolves' mice, specifically their fingertip optimized ones, but it looks like we're waiting a little longer for that. But despite the limitations to the wired connectivity, the Asym's wireless and wired polling rates were perfectly implemented, and all polling rates on both connectivity types worked flawlessly in all the games I tested the Asym in. For battery, the Fenrir Asym uses the same 200 mAh battery we saw used in the Fenrir Max, but again, gwolves is oddly enough not listing any estimated runtimes for the Asym, just like they didn't do on the Max, so I don't have any runtime data to compare my findings to. But regardless, with my Asym running the 1.0.39 firmware set to 30K DPI, the base LED enabled and set to static color, auto sleep set to 600 seconds and placed on a mouse jiggler to simulate constant use. On 1 GHz, my Asym lasted 92 hours, on 2 kHz it lasted 41 hours, on 4 kHz it lasted 23 hours, and on 8 kHz it lasted 17 hours. So, unsurprisingly, given that the Asym uses essentially the same specs as the Max, the battery life is quite similar between these two mice, just the Asym's is slightly lower due to what I assume is the main click switches, but while these estimated runtimes are very impressive for a 250 mAh battery, sadly there is a degree of error to these estimates just as they were on my estimates for the Max, as the web-based driver only shows the battery life in 5% increments. So while the software showed the Asym's battery at 75% for example, in reality the battery could be anywhere between 71 to 75%, so take these estimated values with a grain of salt as your mouse's runtime will probably vary from my measurements. And just to reiterate what I said when I reviewed the Fenrir Max, this newly added comp mode, since it forces the 3950 to scan at a higher locked FPS instead of a variable FPS like it normally does draw additional power and will further reduce the Asym's runtime. However, for my testing, again I had very fluctuating numbers from this comp mode, and the inaccuracy of the WebDriver's battery readout further skewed my data. Because of this, I wasn't able to get any accurate readings on how much this comp mode is going to affect the Asym's runtime, but regardless, if it is enabled, it will reduce the runtime compared to the above values just by varying degrees. But regardless of all this, the battery life here in the Asym is honestly quite good, and keep in mind the battery will likely improve in the future with firmware updates, so make sure to update the Fenrir's firmware whenever there is an update. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the Fenrir does include those 2 extra foam adhesive pads for the mouse's battery, so if you need to replace the battery or want to mod in a larger or smaller capacity one, it's very easy to do so, but this adhesive pad, since it's anchored on top of the PCB right on top of the sensor, it does hang off the rear edge of the PCB by a couple centimeters, and this exposed adhesive does attract a lot of debris to it, so again, as I said earlier, I would highly recommend using the included base cover stickers to prevent debris from building up inside the mouse and on this area of exposed adhesive. In terms of software, the Fenrir Asym uses gwolves web-based software, the same version they've used for all their recently released mice, including the Fenrir Max, and unsurprisingly the software's experience is just as good as it was when I covered those other mice. Now the software here has the same single page layout with multiple tabs, all with different purposes as we've seen before. Firstly, in the DPI tab you can adjust the mouse's DPI levels and set the number of onboard profiles. Here you can also customize the mouse's lighting or disable it entirely. Under the key settings tab you can rebind all the keys on the mouse if needed aside from the left click, but sadly there's no option to rebind a key to swap between the mouse's profiles, so if you utilize multiple profiles on your Asym you'll need to swap between them via the software. Under the parameters tab you can adjust the mouse's debound settings for the main clicks and scroll wheel, adjust the mouse's polling rate, enable or disable angle snapping and ripple, as well as set the mouse's auto sleep timer. If you don't see some of these options in your software, click this little arrow at the top right corner and the menu should expand to show these additional options. Now as I mentioned earlier, the Fenrir Asym also has the same comp mode that was added with the 1.0.39 firmware on the Max, and you can toggle this via a slider here. This mode sets the mouse's sensor to scan at a locked 20,000 FPS instead of the variable lower FPS rates it operates at normally, which increases the performance of the sensor at the cost of additional power draw, but as I said when I reviewed the Max, while it technically improves the mouse's performance, I personally didn't notice any major difference with it when it was enabled or disabled, just as I've experienced with previous implementations of comp modes. So while this feature is nice to have, you're better off utilizing the Fenrir's high polling rates for a more impactful boost to the mouse's performance. Next, let's talk repairability. As I mentioned earlier, unlike many of gwolves' previous very fingertip optimized mice such as the HTR Pro, which was rather difficult to service, the Asym, just like the Max, is a very easy to service mouse, which makes not only cleaning the mouse's internals but also repairing or modding components very easily, specifically the battery, as the mouse includes those extra adhesive pads we talked about a moment ago, and we'll talk all about how to fully disassemble and reassemble the Asym and talk more about the mouse's modding options, individual component weights, and more in the Asym's teardown video, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. For stock skates, as mentioned earlier in this video, the Fenrir Asym comes with a typical 4 PTFE dots pre-installed on its base, but also includes additional 30 PTFE dots and 2 sets of pre-cut full-size skates. Now I tested both types of the included skates over my testing and found the dots to be fine. Again, they're not my favorite type of dot skate due to their small size, but they were fine. The full-size skates, however, were quite surprising, just as they were on the Max, and they performed great here on the Fenrir Asym, and they were the skates I used for the majority of my testing. But if you do want to use aftermarket skates here in the Asym, the Asym's base, just like the Max's, is completely flat, and it's also designed to be quite compatible with aftermarket skates. So just like the Fenrir Max, the Asym will be compatible with 6.5mm dots, 8mm dots and donut skates, and even larger 9.5mm donut skates. And as I mentioned earlier, the mouse also includes these two sheets of foam spacers, both 1 and 1.5mm types, and you can use these on the stock dot skates or similarly sized aftermarket skates to make the skates a little taller, making them more compatible with higher LOD levels or softer pad types. But in my opinion, it's more effective at raising the height of the dots to make them compatible with softer pads. So while these are a bit of an underrated accessory similar to the clay, they are actually quite useful. So I'd recommend holding on to these as they can be quite useful, especially if you plan on using the Asym on a very soft fabric pad. And lastly, let's talk about cables. As I mentioned earlier, just like the Fenrir Max and all of gwolves' recent releases, the Fenrir Asym includes two types of stock cables. The first cable type is a standard USB A to C cable, but it's a thicker, more rigid cable type with a semi-rough paracord wrapping, and the second cable is also USB A to C cable, but it's a much thinner and much more flexible type with a smoother paracord wrapping. Now both these cables perform the same, with the only difference between them being that the thinner cable is much more flexible than the thicker, rigid one. And aside from this difference, I didn't run into any issues with either of the cables over my testing. Now, normally I would critique these cables for being too rigid or not having a tilted USB-C end, but since the Asym isn't designed to be a wired mouse, nor does it support polling rates above 1 kHz on the wire connectivity, I'm going to give gwolves a pass here. However, as I mentioned earlier and as we've seen on gwolves mice before, if you use the Asym wired, it will feel very front heavy because the mouse is so light the cable's weight will unbalance it. But since the mouse only supports 1 kHz polling via its wire connectivity, this isn't the biggest deal, but still keep this in mind if you have to use the Fenrir while it's charging. Alright, well in closing, overall the Fenrir Asym is a very interesting offering from gwolves. I think it does have a lot of benefits as the mouse has great accessories and stock skate options, solid performance, fantastic build quality, a very well executed asymmetrical shape that feels great to use, the lower click design that further improves the mouse's ergonomics, and a more usable scroll wheel due to the shell's lower profile than the Max, and of course just like the Max, the Asym also has great battery life and fantastic repairability, but the mouse also has a lot of issues as the packaging is still using slop AI art, the advertised weight spec is quite inaccurate, and the mouse's low profile does negatively impact its hand and grip compatibility with larger hands. The main click switches are extremely heavy for a fingertip mouse, and the side buttons are still positioned towards the rear of the shell and are quite shallow, which makes them very difficult to use. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have to grip towards the rear of the mouse, which many hands of my size will have to due to the lower shell profile, your thumb will rest on top of the side buttons, which can lead to misactuation issues, which is why I disabled the side buttons on my unit over my testing. So despite my initial thoughts of how the Asym would stack up against the Max is the better of the two Fenrir series mice in my opinion, and while the Max isn't perfect by any means, it's much better for various hand sizes, and its lighter main click switches make the Max's usage experience much better than the Asym's, even with its shallower scroll wheel. However, there are several aspects of the Asym's design that I do think are better than the Max, most notable of which is the asymmetrical shell. So hopefully in the future gwolves will take the best of both the Fenrir Max and the Asym and combine them into a Fenrir Pro model, one that has a taller shell like the Max but an asymmetrical shape, uses the Max's main click switches, reduces the weight, improves the scroll wheel design, and updates the MCU to the newer Nordic SoCs. That would be a fantastic mouse in my opinion, but we'll have to wait and see what gwolves' plans are for the Fenrir series. But in the meantime, if you're considering a Fenrir series mouse, I would still recommend getting the Max over the Asym, as well the Asym has a better shape. The clicks on the Asym are just way too heavy for a fingertip mouse. But if you'd like to learn more about the Fenrir Max or the Asym, you can find both of their product pages linked down in the video description. And if you want to see the inside of the Fenrir Asym and see how to repair or mod this mouse, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the mouse's teardown video. And also I will have my full review of the Fenrir Max linked down in the video description as well. So if you're interested in learning more about the better version of the Fenrir series mice, you can check that video out. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Big thanks again to gwolves for sending over the Fenrir Asym for review. I greatly appreciate it. And big thank you to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you would like to support my efforts here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, and being a member also gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you'd like to support what I do here, become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the gwolves Fenrir Asym, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.